The next person who's going to be talking is also, I hope, made a sacrifice to the demo gods today. Forrest is going to be sharing generic TypeScript React components with us. In his description, he told me he spends a lot of his time watching cat videos, but I also know he happens to be a really great full stack developer who has been a member of this community for a while. So I'm really, really excited to see him give this presentation because I think it's actually a really useful tool to have if you're working in TypeScript with React. Forrest?
Oh, yes. Hopefully everyone can see the screen at the moment. Yes, hello. My name is Forrest Park, and yes, I do spend most of the day watching cat videos. I do believe if I stopped watching them, I might be a better developer. But yes, I am, yes, a full stack developer and full-time software consultant at Rocket Punch. And yes, today I would like to go over something called, as Jacqueline mentioned, generic TypeScript components, one component to rule them all. Going to be creating a generic pure component in React to increase reusability, improve its type safety, and the ability to maintain easily. So if you're any type of developer that has had to rebuild anything that's reusable, I believe that this will be quite useful, and in this specific context, if you're a front-end developer that uses React. So a little bit of background on why I started to build generic TypeScript components. So it was another interesting day at work, and I was tasked to build a table component for a page flow. The requirements were quite specific in the sense of don't make it reusable, just it's only going to be used for this page flow. So just had to build it only specifically for this page. So it had basically a data type that's had person with first name, last name, age, and how many times this user visited this page. Quite simple, I would say. But then, of course, once I finished building the component, CTO goes, hey, I like your table. Let's change all of our tables in the app to use this table. And of course, it had to have different data types. In this case, let's say they had dessert data type as name fields, a calorie field, sweetness, and popularity. But as you can easily see, the data types are totally different in this case. So this one has first name, last name, age, and visits, whereas this data has name, calorie, sweetness, and popularity fields. So it will make it quite difficult to kind of generically reuse the component in a very simplistic way. And today, that's what we're going to go over, how to make a component that is generic enough where you can reuse it anywhere. So we're not going to rebuild a whole table, but we're going to build something a little more simple in this case. We're going to build a very, very simple unordered list, but the component we're going to build, the only responsibility it has is going to be rendering a bullet point on the left, and then rendering whatever string it needs to render in whatever format you want it to render in. So if you look at the code here, fairly simple. We have some person data and some dessert data. It is the same data you saw in the table example from before. First name, last name, age, visits, and for dessert, name, calorie, sweetness, and popularity. Now, if you're trying to build this in the more traditional sense of a reusable component in React, you would have to do some if statement trickery, basically saying, hey, I'm accepting some data as a prop, but check if this data has a first name, last name, and so on. If that field exists in TypeScript, then, exists in the field, then render this specific component, this JSX, in a very specific way. For example, first name, last name, age, years old, and visit times. But if the data has a field name, calories, and so on, render it this specific way. And of course, the props accept these specific data types. But if you're familiar with this pattern, then you'll see that this will very quickly become a problem, because if you add another piece of data type, then you'll have to write one more if statement. For example, if drink, just writing pseudocode here, return drink JSX. And then of course, as developers, we know 2 months later, somebody's going to add one more piece of data saying some kind of food, for example. And hey, now we have like 60 if statements in this one component, and no one can maintain this because this component no longer makes sense. So now let's move over to trying to build a component that you don't have to have if statements using TypeScript generics. So I'm going to close this component here, have a new component that has a kind of starting point. But of course, the difference here is the data is not going to be a specific type of data, but it's going to accept generic data. So if you're familiar with TypeScript, the TypeScript generic is a symbol called T. So the data is a generic type T, it can be whatever type it wants. You send down. Of course, if you want to send it down to the data, you just pass it through the props here. And TypeScript is already giving us a little error message saying, hey, you need to add the type T here, the generic type T here. And of course, you have to add it to the functional component itself. So essentially, this is a function saying, hey, it's going to accept a generic type T. Now, on the other side, before we were using the list example component to render this. Right now, I'm going to change this to the bullet point component and then save it. Also save it here. Luckily, nothing is breaking up to now, so thank you, demo gods. Going to add the TypeScript generic type as well here, just to specify what kind of data it is. In this case, this is going to be person. And this is going to be dessert. Yep, I'll have to import that, of course. And nothing is breaking yet. So great stuff. Now, the data itself is going to be, the data type itself is going to be sent down into the component. And hey, this component is going to dynamically understand what kind of data it's receiving. But here, as you can see, it's still not able to render the specific data strings we want or the data fields we want. But remember, the only responsibility this component has, this is the most important part of the code right here, the list li element that will render the bullet point in front. So here would be the dynamic part. Now, there are basically two ways to do this, but I will do it in a way that is more familiar to, I guess, React Native developers. If you're a React Native developer, you'll instantly understand what type of component I'm trying to build. So I'm going to go back over here and also send down a prop saying, hey, I want you to run a anonymous component and render some JSX. In this case, let me actually go back to the list example. I'm going to copy this over because this is the exact format of JSX I want to render, in this case for a person, and in this case for a piece of dessert. So I'm just going to copy this over. I'm going to reuse this. Of course, you can extract this into a reusable component in the traditional sense, but not for the sake of the demo. We'll not do that at the moment. Going to copy this over into the dessert array map as well. Here. And it's going to render here. Of course, when I save this, nothing's going to happen yet because on the other side of the bullet point component, I'm still not actually using the render prop yet. Now, let's go with the type first. Of course, I have to add render as a prop first as well. And this is where it becomes quite interesting. So it's going to receive some data because it's an anonymous function. It could receive an argument, and the data is going to be pumped into the new React node, in this case, React node, the span, and as well. In this case, of course, the data will be T because it's generic and it's going to be received from the function itself, and it's going to return. In this case, it's going to be a React.React node. Copilot is helping me a lot here. And we want to also add, so we could receive, deconstruct the render prop here. And essentially, what we're going to do is run this function. You're going to execute this function with the data that is received in the component itself. So we have the data coming in here. It's passed down into the function, and then what it does is render whatever JSX you add into it. So hey, it didn't break, so lucky me. So in this case, what I essentially did, if you're, as I mentioned, if you're familiar with React Native, this is essentially a React Native list item component. So you're sending down a generic piece of data. You're sending down how you want to render that specific piece of data. But remember, the only responsibility this bullet point component had was to render an LI element and anything else basically generically. So the amazing thing is, now that this bullet point component is built, you never have to worry about it again. So if, let's say, 2 years in the future, some other list in the app needed a bullet point with some kind of data rendered, string rendered essentially in the back, then you could just take this component because it only renders a bullet point and then reuse this nearly infinitely, set it and forget it. So this is the beauty of TypeScript generic components, in my opinion. If you build it robust enough with good generics, then you can build it once and never have to build it again. Now, this is a very simple example of just, of course, a bullet point, but as in my example before, you could use it to render a table in a very specific way, or you could render even a whole web page using generic components and what I call compound React components, but that's a different story. So this is a very simple example of using TypeScript generics in a React component, but hopefully this was helpful and you could use it in your everyday React development. So if you have any questions, yeah, please shoot away.
That's good stuff. Very relevant to those of us who are kind of in TypeScript for the first time these days.
Thank you. Yes, generics are very powerful.
Did you always work in TypeScript, or were you working in bare.js before you worked in TypeScript? And you did front end stuff.
When the first ever job I had, it was bare JavaScript, and the argument there was because there was only 2 of us in the team, so it didn't matter too much. But once I moved to a team that had, I think there was like 7 developers just on that team. Yes, we had to use TypeScript. It was just impossible not to use it, I would say. And I've never looked back ever since, because it just adds so much functionality to what you can do within the JavaScript ecosystem.
Very, very cool. Yeah, strongly typed languages help prevent lots of bugs. So thank you very much for showing us how we can change our code to not need a ton of if statements. That's super useful. I know I don't like a bunch of if statements in my code.